From a very young age, these enchanting narratives carve out a unique space within your life. The custom of sharing bedtime stories traces its roots back to ancient routines, emerging when weary individuals would gather around a crackling hearth as darkness fell and the evening meal concluded. During these quiet moments, people naturally began weaving tales, engaging in a profoundly grounded practice that provides essential nourishment for your inner self. Interestingly, the terms human and humility both originate from humus, the Latin word for earth, underscoring why acting humbly is universally revered as an ultimate virtue. This ancient wisdom dictates that those who elevate themselves will eventually be brought low, whereas the unassuming are ultimately elevated. The fireplace stood as such a vital core of domestic life that its name became synonymous with the family dwelling itself, giving rise to familiar phrases like hearth and home. These enduring legends captivate your mind, offering a comforting embrace that emerges from the legendary domain of human imagination, acting as an essential counterbalance to your mundane daily routine. Because you are fundamentally a creature driven to weave narratives, pausing to contemplate the fables you absorbed during your youth offers profound lessons for your current existence. Such stories carry a seemingly mystical quality because they bridge the gap to suppressed feelings that struggle to find an outlet in your external reality. As you mature, society and your peers often dismiss the visionary world of make-believe, labeling it a fruitless pursuit completely devoid of practical value. Consequently, you are pushed onto a strictly sequential trajectory focused purely on education, employment, and eventually building a family. However, this narrow focus turns perilous when it becomes overwhelmingly unbalanced, aggressively stifling the psychological archetype of eternal youth residing within you. When this happens, human existence devolves into a robotic routine, stripped of childhood wonder, playful joy, aesthetic appreciation, and genuine ingenuity, rendering your days incredibly dull and utterly purposeless. Whenever you fail to uncover true meaning, the natural tendency is to anesthetize your mind with fleeting indulgences that briefly mask the profound emptiness echoing inside. These mythical narratives offer profound reassurance, reminding you that you are certainly not isolated in your ongoing personal battles. Humanity has confronted these exact same hardships in various guises since the dawn of time, and mythical folklore perfectly encapsulates these universal anxieties of the human condition. Whenever you read narratives featuring valiant warriors battling ferocious dragons, you are actually observing a reflection of your own existence. Those mythical beasts symbolize the severe trials and inevitable tribulations you must face, serving as demanding yet vital stepping stones on the journey toward actualizing your ultimate, ideal self. The metaphorical wealth you acquire along this journey acts as the primary catalyst driving you toward genuine self-realization. By fostering a deeper comprehension of your own psyche, you naturally develop a much richer understanding of other people and the broader universe surrounding you. You consistently receive an invitation to embark on a transformative adventure, a profound calling that you have the ultimate freedom to either embrace or decline. You possess the agency to tackle the daunting challenges that unlock unprecedented rewards, or you can choose to flee, thereby risking a devastating plunge into a chasm of dread, melancholy, and total existential void. Consequently, whenever hardship strikes, you should avoid hastily classifying it as an entirely detrimental occurrence, because such trials might actually carve open concealed chambers within your spirit, exposing an abundance of hidden psychological wealth. Consider the scenario of a humble agricultural worker relentlessly tilling his land, only to have his daily labor suddenly halted when his equipment strikes a solid, immovable object. This unexpected disruption leads him to uncover a concealed gateway, descending into a vast subterranean cavern, overflowing with unimaginable riches. Once you manage to unearth this deeply buried psychological wealth, your next critical responsibility is to weave these profound realms of aesthetic wonder directly into your ordinary daily routine. Adversity frequently disrupts your chosen path for incredibly valid reasons that you might not comprehend in the immediate moment. Unforgettable figures, like the trickster wolf from Little Red Riding Hood, the conversational amphibian in The Frog King, or the malevolent sorceress stalking Hansel and Gretel, are destined to linger in your imagination forever. The same holds true for Rapunzel, the captive maiden with endlessly flowing hair, and the incredibly sensitive royal from The Princess and the Pea. The thrilling escapades detailed in these myths frequently mirror the real-world obstacles you must navigate during your own personal development. Far from being simple amusement for young ones, these narratives conceal an absolute abundance of profound wisdom just beneath their whimsical exterior. Unearthing the fables that shaped your early development and analyzing the distinct personalities you either adored or despised yields a remarkably valuable psychological reward. The specific designation fairy tale was originally coined by the French author Madame d'Aulnoy during the latter half of the 17th century. This category falls under the broader umbrella of the folklore genre, seamlessly blending mythological themes, traditional cultural wisdom, ethical instruction, and pure imaginative amusement. Furthermore, these narratives occupy a unique liminal space, simultaneously embodying both the mundane physical world and the sacred intangible realm. The central hero or heroine inevitably departs from their ordinary surroundings, crossing the threshold into a supernatural environment where he or she encounters the undeniable presence of magic, hidden treasures, communicating animals or objects, and mythical beings such as fairies, dragons, dwarfs, giants, elves, mermaids, and witches. The fundamental characters and recurring motifs found within fairy tales operate as deep psychological archetypes, bound together by supernatural elements. Within these legendary spaces, you will encounter a complete spectrum of symbolic figures: the hero, the child, the shadow, the trickster, the fool, the wise old man, the maiden, and the devouring mother. These narratives vividly illustrate the transition from your standard conscious reality into the awe-inspiring, mysterious depths of the unconscious mind, followed by a necessary return to everyday life. A story might conclude with the protagonist re-entering the mundane world enriched with newfound fortune, or returning entirely empty-handed, possessing only the immense relief of having survived and escaped the swallowing forces of the devouring unconscious. Conversely, whenever a narrative strands its hero permanently within the magical dimension, it typically symbolizes a tragic psychological defeat where the individual is entirely swallowed by the unconscious. To illustrate this dynamic, let us examine the classic tale of Jack and the Beanstalk. Plagued by severe poverty and lacking the means to afford food, a desperate mother instructs Jack to sell their sole remaining cow. The boy exchanges the animal for a handful of magic beans, but upon returning to his home, his mother erupts in violent fury over his failure to secure actual money, forcefully casting the seeds outside. By the following morning, a colossal beanstalk has erupted from the soil. Jack ascends this towering plant and eventually reaches a celestial kingdom in the sky, an elevated domain where a fearsome giant and his wife reside. Desperate for sustenance, the boy requests a meal, which the giant's benevolent wife graciously provides. However, once the towering husband reaches home, he instantly detects the scent of an Englishman's blood and declares his murderous intentions, only to be pacified by his wife claiming that nobody is there. Seizing the opportunity, Jack steals a heavy sack of gold coins from the giant and swiftly climbs back down. He repeats this daring ascent on 2 subsequent occasions, ultimately stealing a magical hen that lays golden eggs, along with an enchanted harp that plays beautiful music entirely by itself. During this final heist, the sentient musical instrument cries out to its master, prompting the enraged giant to launch a terrifying high-speed pursuit after the fleeing Jack. Racing swiftly down the towering stalk, Jack retrieves his axe and severs the massive plant, sending the colossal adversary plummeting to his doom, thereby securing boundless wealth and an eternally joyful existence for his family. In everyday conversation, you will often hear this genre's title employed to characterize impossibly cheerful conclusions or fantastical concepts existing purely within the realm of human imagination. As you cultivate a more profound understanding of your own consciousness, these ancient narratives frequently unveil fresh layers of significance and symbolic depth that previously remained entirely obscured from view. Within this psychological framework, the malevolent villains and sinister figures lurking within these pages frequently symbolize those specific traits within yourself that you have actively suppressed or completely disregarded. A recurring motif, the dense, impenetrable woodland, serves as a powerful metaphor for your internal shadow, encompassing all the unexplored and hidden territories of your psyche, where terrifying metaphorical beasts reside. This untamed wilderness embodies those inherent instincts within you that defy complete subjugation and perpetually retain a thrilling aura of danger. Yet, it is precisely within this enigmatic and frightening psychological space that you will ultimately discover an incredibly elusive and profoundly valuable internal prize. Every single person must eventually navigate this shadowy and intimidating psychological corridor during their lifetime, even though your initial instinct is invariably to shrink away and avoid the journey entirely. Looking back, however, you frequently recognize that traversing these harrowing experiences provided incredibly crucial opportunities, essentially compelling you to unearth and embrace completely unfamiliar dimensions of your own character. Shifting from psychological symbolism to historical origins, these enchanting narratives have flourished through both spoken word and written manuscripts throughout human history. Within the vastly older tradition of verbal recitation, the narratives evolved slightly with each subsequent performance, organically generating a multitude of distinct regional adaptations. It stands as a remarkable testament to the compelling nature of oral transmission that countless legends endured for generations without ever being committed to parchment. While earliest written examples, such as the Indo-European story The Smith and the Devil, are theorized to originate as early as the Bronze Age. This ancient text chronicles a metalworker who strikes a desperate agreement with a wicked entity, exchanging his eternal spirit for extraordinary abilities before ultimately deceiving the fiend to retain his ultimate reward, an archetype distinctly echoing the classic Faustian bargain. Countless familiar narratives you recognize today, including Jack and the Beanstalk, Beauty and the Beast, and Rumpelstiltskin, actually sprout from the foundational bedrock of much older mythologies stretching back millennia. In an era long before the advent of broadcast media or printed journalism, these captivating chronicles served as the primary fascination for the general public, providing a clear window into how such enduring folklore originally blossomed. An alternative scholarly perspective suggests these fantastical yarns represent the fragmented remnants of a once elevated but subsequently degraded literary tradition. Up until the 17th and 18th centuries, and continuing today within isolated indigenous communities, these captivating legends were shared indiscriminately with mature audiences and young people alike, serving as the primary source of amusement for agrarian societies during the long, harsh winter months. The recitation of these fables evolved into a profoundly necessary and deeply spiritual communal practice, frequently characterized by historians as embodying the fundamental philosophy of the spinning wheel. Relegating these profound narratives strictly to the domain of childhood nurseries is a surprisingly recent historical shift, likely stemming from society's increasing dismissal of the irrational and the simultaneous rise of a strictly logical worldview. Consequently, society began dismissing these rich traditions as mere nonsense and trivial fables suitable only for entertaining infants. And only in contemporary times have you begun to reawaken to their staggering psychological significance. Because these imaginative creations and nocturnal visions lack empirical scientific rigidity, many individuals incorrectly assume they can be loosely interpreted, casually altered, or selectively cherry-picked to suit personal preferences, while discarding the remaining elements. This highly questionable, entirely unscientific, and frankly deceitful approach has dominated the cultural understanding of mythological folklore for an extended period of history. Consequently, contemporary adaptations of these classic narratives routinely scrub away the bizarre, macabre, and deeply unsettling elements that originally characterized the authentic historical texts. In Germany, the Brothers Grimm pioneered the systematic compilation of these stories, igniting a passionate global movement to preserve regional folklore by initially transcribing the verbal accounts exactly as dictated by local citizens, though eventually even they succumbed to the temptation of blending multiple distinct variations together. To their credit, the siblings possessed the integrity to transparently document their editorial alterations within their private correspondence and published annotations. Nevertheless, they lacked the rigorous empirical methodology practiced by contemporary ethnologists and folklorists, who meticulously transcribe narratives word for word, deliberately preserving all inherent logical inconsistencies and narrative gaps. Despite these editorial liberties, the anthology released by the Brothers Grimm achieved phenomenal commercial and cultural triumph, clearly tapping into a profound, unacknowledged psychological resonance that subsequently inspired nations worldwide to feverishly compile their own foundational mythological repositories. Researchers were immediately astonished by the staggering volume of identical narrative motifs appearing simultaneously across vastly different global cultures, prompting an intensive academic quest to uncover the surviving fragments of a universal, ancient wisdom. Exploring this phenomenon in his critical essay on fairy stories, the renowned English author J.R.R. Tolkien defined this genre as any narrative unfolding within the magical dominion of fairy, regardless of whether actual mystical sprites appeared within the text. While Celtic traditions respectfully refer to these magical inhabitants as the good folk or little people, it is crucial to recognize that fiercely malevolent variations of these creatures also prominently feature in the ancient lore. Deeply rooted in Irish mythology, the chilling concept of the changeling describes a deceptive, supernatural imp secretly swapped into a cradle to replace a human infant abducted by ethereal entities. One fascinating theological hypothesis regarding the genesis of these mystical beings posits that during the war in heaven, while the rebellious spirits plummeted to the underworld and the victorious remained above, a faction of unaligned angels became permanently stranded in a purgatorial middle ground, condemned to wander the mortal plane as magical sprites. By engaging with the fantastic, you are granted passage into an entirely coherent and logically sound alternate reality, governed by a set of physical and magical laws entirely separate from your everyday existence. These enchanting narratives frequently offer profound emotional and ethical comfort by delivering universally uplifting conclusions, a literary device Tolkien famously labeled as a Eucatastrophe. This brilliant concept describes a shocking, miraculous pivot in the storyline, where the hero is suddenly rescued from absolutely certain destruction, thereby generating a deeply moving and overwhelmingly powerful sensation of euphoria within these serious, fantastical epics. Dedicating the majority of her professional career to the rigorous analysis of folklore, the esteemed Jungian psychoanalyst, Marie-Louise von Franz, stands out as the pioneering intellect who definitively illuminated the profound psychological profundity embedded within these ancient stories. Capturing this essence perfectly, she asserted that these enduring magical narratives represent the absolute clearest and most unadulterated manifestation of collective unconscious psychic processes known to humanity. Consequently, these narratives possess an unparalleled worth when it comes to the scientific examination of the unconscious mind, far surpassing any other available resources. They embody archetypes in their most unadorned, essential, and abbreviated states. By examining these pristine archetypal images, you gain the most reliable insights into the hidden dynamics actively shaping the collective psyche. While more complex mythological constructs, such as legends, certainly contain the fundamental blueprints of the human mind, those core elements are typically buried beneath heavy layers of specific cultural artifacts. Fairy tales, conversely, strip away this conscious societal overlay, allowing you to observe the mind's foundational structures with striking clarity. Classical myths, featuring figures like Ulysses and Hercules, serve as profound reflections of the specific national identity from which they emerged, which in this case is ancient Greece. Because these epics often display a more refined aesthetic structure than simpler stories, certain academics mistakenly elevate the myth as the supreme literary form, dismissing everything else as insignificant fragments. In contrast to these grand cultural expressions, legends function as unprovable historical accounts passed down through generations, traditionally accepted by people as actual occurrences within human history. Folklore and fairy tales, however, spring directly from the imaginative visions of everyday pastoral communities, rather than the intellectual elite. This origin gives them the distinct benefit of remaining delightfully unpretentious. Because they were forged collaboratively by communities, they offer pristine archetypal material entirely free from the distortions of individual psychological struggles. Because of this universal quality, you can easily grasp the meaning of a fairy tale, regardless of your geographical location, as these narratives effortlessly transcend national boundaries. Despite these differences, myths remain absolutely crucial, acting as an interpretive bridge whenever you struggle to comprehend the meaning of folklore that feels excessively disconnected from your everyday conscious reality. Ultimately, both of these storytelling traditions empower the human imagination to effectively articulate the deeper significance of our life experiences. To successfully penetrate the archetypal realm, you must present concepts in their authentic, unvarnished state without adding unnecessary embellishments. Because fairy tales accurately reflect humanity's most fundamental psychological architecture, they provide the optimal environment for you to analyze the very anatomy of the human mind. It is exactly this rigorous scientific approach that guided Marie-Louise von Franz in her quest to decipher the objective psyche, a concept recognized by Carl Jung as the collective unconscious, which serves as the repository for archetypes and humanity's inherited behavioral templates. Conversely, the subjective psyche, or personal unconscious, functions as a storage space for an individual's acquired experiences that have either faded from memory or been actively repressed. Within this deeply personal space reside your complexes, which are essentially clusters of thoughts and images carrying a heavy emotional weight. While your nightly dreams primarily unfold within this personal realm, fairy tales act as direct manifestations of the broader collective unconscious, though both phenomena possess the power to activate underlying complexes and archetypes. By adopting a subjective perspective, you are able to uncover the deeply intimate imagery nestled within your own emotional responses, thereby creating a vital release valve for hidden internal struggles. Nevertheless, to truly understand your position within the ancient, primordial images of humanity, you must transcend your individual ego and embrace a broader, objective viewpoint. The fantastical events unfolding in the magical domains of folklore share a profound similarity with your nightly visions, as both enchanted landscapes vividly symbolize the unconscious mind at work. Carl Jung perfectly encapsulated this idea when he noted that during slumber, you are essentially seeking counsel from the 2-million-year-old version of yourself that resides within. Amplification stands out as a cornerstone technique within Jungian psychology for exploring the depths of the mind. Whenever you exhaust your own subjective interpretations of internal imagery, whether generated through dreams, artistic endeavors, or the process of active imagination, fairy tales offer an invaluable tool for decoding their symbolic weight by connecting your personal experiences to the vast, collective unconscious. This concept is beautifully illustrated in the Red Book, where Carl Jung converses with a princess during a state of active imagination. She urges him not to dismiss the fantastical, reminding him that the fairy tale gave birth to the modern novel and holds a far deeper, universal truth than any contemporary literature. She wisely points out that the stories repeated continuously over millennia ultimately bring you closest to absolute human reality, cautioning against letting an aversion to the magical create a barrier to understanding. You should actively apply the profound wisdom embedded in these ancient narratives to decipher the immense challenges currently confronting modern society. However, attempting to view the folklore exclusively through the distorted lens of today's collective crises is fundamentally counterproductive. The correct approach requires you to first immerse yourself in the fairy tale itself, and only then project its insights onto contemporary dilemmas. Even though these stories have constantly evolved to reflect shifting cultural norms and societal expectations over the centuries, the underlying archetypes have preserved their original integrity. As von Franz so vividly describes, the process of hunting down the true meaning of a fairy tale is remarkably similar to the delicate art of tracking an incredibly elusive stag through a dense forest. To properly analyze an archetypal narrative, you must dissect it into distinct phases, much like you would interpret a dream, starting with the exposition, which establishes the temporal and spatial setting. These tales famously open with the phrase, "Once upon a time," instantly transporting the listener into the timeless, boundless void characteristic of the collective unconscious. Within this ethereal landscape of the human soul, you will inevitably encounter a distinctly structured focal point, which might manifest as a grand palace, a square dwelling, or perhaps a circular lake featuring a central island. It is exclusively within this constructed epicenter that the crucial psychological transformations occur, and where you finally confront the primary dilemma hidden at the heart of the story. Moving into the second phase of interpretation, your attention must shift to the dramatis personae, examining the specific individuals participating in the narrative arc. A highly effective analytical technique is to carefully tally the number of characters present at both the opening and the conclusion of the narrative. For instance, if a story introduces a monarch with 3 male heirs, you immediately recognize a quartet of figures, while noticing the glaring absence of a maternal presence, suggesting the underlying motive might be the restoration of the divine feminine principle. Following this character analysis, the third analytical step requires you to explicitly identify the central conflict driving the plot forward, which could be represented by something as symbolic as an aging sovereign suffering from a mysterious illness. Finally, the analytical journey culminates in the fourth stage, known as the peripeteia, representing the dramatic turning point, the escalating tension, and the ultimate climax that dictates whether the conclusion will be triumphant or tragic. It is essential to remember that, much like a dream remains its own most accurate translator, and any external analysis inevitably falls short of the raw experience, attempting to dissect myths and folklore can sometimes obscure the brilliant illumination inherent in the original narratives. In fact, this precise concern regarding the potential dilution of the source material's intrinsic power remains one of the most frequently voiced criticisms directed at the broader Jungian interpretive framework. Relying solely on the practice of non-interpretation frequently falls short, leaving an individual akin to someone possessing a chest full of riches but lacking the vital key to unlock it. Without this crucial access, what purpose do such profound inner treasures serve? All too often, these mental assets remain entirely untapped, leading to an unnecessarily impoverished human existence. Consequently, the art of interpretation must be actively cultivated, primarily because we naturally tend to analyze our own myths and nocturnal visions through the rigid, biased lens of our pre-existing conscious beliefs. To determine if an analytical conclusion is genuinely accurate, you should observe whether it profoundly resonates or clicks within you, while carefully monitoring your subsequent dreams to see if they follow a similar thematic trajectory. or highlight repressed elements that demand conscious attention. While a trained psychologist can offer an invaluable objective perspective to help you uncover the key to your internal wealth, the ultimate heavy lifting must be accomplished by the patient themselves. As von Franz eloquently observes, she constantly advises her students against merely memorizing her lectures, urging them instead to practice analyzing fairy tales independently, as this remains the sole genuine method of mastery. She emphasizes that such analytical work is fundamentally an art and a craft that relies entirely upon your own personal engagement. When a group of individuals examines the exact same narrative in a classroom setting, the process inevitably transforms into a simultaneous confession and a Rorschach test. This outcome is completely unavoidable, because you are compelled to project your entire being into the analysis. According to von Franz, archetypal narratives most frequently emerge when an individual experiences a sudden influx of unconscious material, whether manifesting through a profound dream or a vivid waking hallucination. This mechanism perfectly illustrates how established tribal rituals can ultimately evolve from a single person's deeply archetypal encounter. Furthermore, when the psychological impact of such a vision is overwhelmingly powerful, the recipient feels an irresistible compulsion to broadcast their intimate secret to the community rather than concealing it. Ultimately, it is the fundamental architecture of our psychic structure that generates these potent symbols. This dynamic reinforces the profound notion that people do not simply possess ideas, rather, ideas possess people. Within tribal societies, a shaman interprets these extraordinary experiences as collective visions bestowed upon the entire community, positioning the individual experiencer as nothing more than a humble courier of the message. We frequently encounter narratives centered around animals, yet these characters inevitably function as highly anthropomorphic entities rather than literal beasts. Examined through a psychological lens, they serve as symbolic vessels designed to carry the projection of human mental and emotional factors. They are fundamentally human in nature because they illustrate our own primal drives rather than actual animal instincts. For instance, a ravenous tiger in a fable does not embody literal feline hunger, but rather symbolizes our own ferocious, tiger-like greed. Such anthropomorphic depictions constitute one of the most primordial and fundamental categories of archetypal storytelling. Young children naturally gravitate toward these creature-based fables because convoluted narratives featuring complex demons or royalty demand far too much contextual explanation. However, simply stating that a dog spoke to a cat immediately captures their eager attention, suggesting that this format serves as the foundational bedrock of narrative and the most ancient expression of the tale. These fantastical stories play an indispensable role in our individuation process, a journey where hidden unconscious elements are acknowledged and seamlessly woven into our waking awareness, allowing an individual to actualize their true self. Within the framework of Jungian psychology, achieving this synthesis stands as the ultimate objective for all human beings. Various fables offer generalized snapshots of specific developmental stages, whether illustrating shadow integration, the assimilation of the anima or animus, or navigating archetypal father and mother images, all of which dynamically point toward the realization of the self. Reflecting on her extensive career, von Franz concluded that every fairy tale tirelessly attempts to delineate a singular psychic fact, yet this phenomenon is so overwhelmingly intricate that it requires hundreds of stories and thousands of repetitions with musical variations before the unknown concept can be fully delivered into consciousness. Even after such endless iteration, the core theme remains far from exhausted. This profoundly mysterious element is precisely what Jung identified as the self, representing both the absolute psychic totality of an individual and, paradoxically, the central regulating mechanism of the collective unconscious. Every distinct nation and individual possesses unique frameworks for experiencing this profound psychic reality. By placing your trust in your inner voice and following its direction, even when it directly contradicts popular consensus, you allow the unconscious to chart your course, ensuring that your descent into the mental depths yields astonishing, unforeseen riches. This dynamic embodies the central struggle found within virtually all fables, universally depicted as the great journey, or the perilous quest to secure a remarkably elusive treasure. In the subsequent segment, we will explore a selection of traditional fairy tales. The initial story will feature a detailed interpretation, while the rest will be presented without analysis, so that you may reflect upon them independently. A legendary tale speaks of an aging king who fathered 3 sons. While the eldest 2 were celebrated for their sharp intellect and wisdom, the youngest remained notably quiet and earned the unfortunate moniker of the Simpleton. As the sovereign grew increasingly frail and began contemplating his mortality, he found himself utterly uncertain about which descendant should rightfully inherit his sprawling kingdom. Eventually, he announced to his heirs that the royal crown would be bestowed upon whoever could procure the most magnificent carpet in the land. To determine their respective paths, the elderly ruler cast 3 feathers into the air, commanding his sons to travel wherever the plumes drifted. 1 feather caught a breeze toward the east, another sailed steadily westward, but the final plume merely drifted straight upward before quickly plummeting back to the earth nearby. The older siblings ruthlessly mocked Simpleton, who was seemingly condemned to remain exactly where he stood, wallowing in his apparent misfortune. As he sat in a state of deep melancholy, the youngest brother suddenly noticed a hidden trap door situated immediately adjacent to his fallen feather. Lifting the heavy wooden hatch, he descended a hidden staircase and eventually knocked upon a mysterious subterranean door. He was greeted by a massive toad, surrounded by a legion of smaller amphibians, and upon politely requesting an exquisite carpet, the peculiar creature promptly provided him with a woven masterpiece. Expressing his deep gratitude, the young man departed with his prize, while his arrogant older siblings, assuming their foolish brother would inevitably return empty-handed, lazily procured some cheap handkerchiefs without exerting any real effort. When Simpleton presented his breathtaking tapestry to the court, the astounded king immediately proclaimed that his youngest child would be the sole heir to the throne. However, the fiercely envious older brothers continuously badgered their father, vehemently protesting that a boy entirely devoid of common sense could never be permitted to rule the kingdom. Establishing a fresh decree, the monarch announced that the throne would pass to whoever could present the most exquisite ring. Once more, the downy plumes guided the youngest son back to the corpulent amphibian, who readily supplied the magnificent jewelry he requested. Meanwhile, his older siblings mocked his earnest efforts and lazily presented common nails, leading their father to declare the youngest the rightful heir upon seeing his breathtaking prize. Relentless badgering from the older siblings forced the ruler to impose a third stipulation, promising the crown to the son who returned with the most breathtaking bride. Returning to his subterranean benefactor, the youngest learned the maiden was not immediately available, though he was handed a hollowed-out yellow turnip pulled by 6 mice. Following the amphibian's bizarre instructions to place a smaller frog inside this makeshift carriage, he witnessed a miraculous transformation. As the vegetable became a grand coach, the rodents transformed into magnificent steeds, and the tiny creature morphed into a stunning young woman, whom he promptly escorted to the palace. Having lazily retrieved the first rustic workers they encountered, the older siblings were outraged when the sovereign once again chose the youngest, demanding a final physical trial where the brides must vault through a suspended hoop. While the sturdy but clumsy commoners plummeted and fractured their limbs during the attempt, the exquisite maiden bounded through the air with the effortless grace of a deer. This decisive victory finally secured the diadem for the youngest prince, initiating a long and prudent reign over the realm. I invite you to delve into the psychological layers of this narrative, where you can observe a classic configuration featuring a patriarch alongside three male heirs, the most junior of whom is deemed a simpleton. This recurring fourfold motif frequently aligns with the analytical framework of Carl Jung's psychological types, specifically encompassing thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Within this dynamic, the ruling monarch embodies the conscious and dominant function, whereas the marginalized youngest sibling signifies the inferior function, supported by the middle brothers acting as auxiliary functions, culminating in a quaternity that perfectly symbolizes the psychic image of the self. As the supposedly intelligent siblings stubbornly repeat their failing strategies, the ailing sovereign emerges as the true dilemma, illustrating the breakdown of a prevailing conscious attitude exhausted by sheer overexertion. You often encounter this psychological phenomenon during the latter half of existence, when your attention naturally drifts from external achievements toward internal reflection. Consequently, a severe misalignment during this transitional phase frequently triggers a midlife crisis, stemming from an overly rigid and one-sided approach to navigating human existence. To restore balance, the governing consciousness must connect with its inferior function, forging a vital pathway to the unconscious depths where the archetype of the Great Mother dwells in her amphibious guise. Ultimately, the concluding challenge requires the profound integration of the anima, which serves as the personification of all female psychological tendencies in man and represents the very archetype of life itself. Only through this successful assimilation can the discarded aspect inherit the kingdom, representing a symbol of wholeness, allowing a vibrant, capable energy to replace the obsolete and rigid patterns of the past. Shifting our focus to the tale of Rumpelstiltskin, the story introduces an impoverished miller who foolishly attempted to elevate his social standing by boasting to the sovereign that his stunning offspring could magically weave ordinary straw into pure gold. Intrigued by this lucrative prospect, the monarch summoned the young woman to the royal estate, locking her inside a chamber filled with dry stalks and issuing a grim ultimatum that she would face execution if she failed to complete the impossible task by dawn. Left entirely alone with a useless spinning wheel, the terrified prisoner spiraled into deep despair, eventually breaking down into uncontrollable sobs as her impending doom loomed closer. Suddenly, a diminutive stranger breached the locked quarters, questioning the source of her immense sorrow and offering his supernatural assistance in exchange for her personal necklace. Operating the machinery with rapid precision, the mysterious figure successfully transformed the agricultural waste into precious metal, which only fueled the ruler's insatiable avarice upon discovery the following morning. Relocated to an even more expansive storage area overflowing with stalks, the captive wept once more, until her peculiar savior rematerialized, willing to repeat his miraculous feat in exchange for the ring upon her finger. Consumed by bottomless greed, the monarch corralled the exhausted woman into a colossal hall, dangling the promise of matrimony if she survived this final golden ordeal. Bereft of any worldly possessions to barter when the little man materialized, she desperately pledged her future firstborn infant to secure his aid, ultimately ascending to the throne when the king discovered the sparkling hoard. Over a year later, the newly crowned sovereign was horrified when the creature arrived to claim his horrific payment, prompting her to offer vast treasures until he agreed to forfeit the baby if she could correctly identify his true name within a strict 3-day deadline, leaving her to frantically scour the land for unusual monikers as the first and second days rapidly expired. As you follow this tale to its conclusion on the third day, the emissary returned with peculiar news of spotting a bizarre figure hopping on a single limb. This strange individual was chanting a rhyme about baking today, brewing tomorrow, and claiming the infant royal soon after, while boasting that nobody guessed his moniker was Rumpelstiltskin. Upon the miniature gentleman's arrival, the sovereign confidently revealed his true identity, prompting an outburst where he accused dark forces of whispering the secret to her. Consumed by furious indignation, the creature drove his right foot so forcefully into the soil that it sank to the thigh, subsequently gripping his left limb with such violent desperation that he literally ripped his own body apart. You might now turn your attention to the classic story known as the Frog King, or Iron Henry, set during an era when making a wish could actually alter destiny. Within this distant epoch resided a monarch blessed with stunning female offspring, though the junior member of the family possessed unparalleled loveliness. During a particularly heated afternoon, this radiant princess retreated into the woods to relax near a chilling spring, entertaining herself by tossing a gilded sphere into the air and catching it. Inevitably, the precious toy plummeted into the deep waters, disappearing completely from her sight, despite her frantic searching. As tears streamed down her face, a mysterious voice suddenly inquired about her distress, noting that her profound sorrow could evoke compassion from solid rock. Glancing around, the royal maiden spotted an amphibian thrusting its bulky, unattractive snout above the surface, prompting her to explain the loss of her glittering toy. The creature offered its assistance, questioning what reward it might receive for retrieving the object, to which she eagerly promised any treasure it desired, including her garments, gemstones, and even her royal diadem. However, you will notice that material wealth held no appeal for the amphibian. It solely desired to become her constant associate and friend. Outwardly agreeing to all its demands, she secretly dismissed the water-dweller as utterly ridiculous. Moments later, the creature emerged, bearing the lost item in its jaws, filling the girl with such joy that she immediately sprinted away, completely ignoring the rescuer's desperate pleas to not be left behind. Pushing the unfortunate creature from her mind entirely, she was startled the following afternoon while dining from her exquisite metallic dish by a rhythmic tapping at the entrance. Upon investigating, she discovered her swamp-dwelling acquaintance waiting patiently outside. Overcome by sudden terror, the young woman forcefully shut the heavy wooden barrier. Observing her alarm, the monarch inquired about the source of her panic, leading her to confess the presence of a repulsive amphibian and the hasty agreement she had made the previous day. As another round of knocking echoed through the hall, the sovereign sternly instructed his child that she was bound by her word and must grant the visitor entry. Reluctantly obeying her father's strict command, she allowed the slimy guest inside, who promptly trailed behind her every step. The uninvited guest boldly perched upon her dish, forcing them to share a meal, which, you can imagine, caused her immense revulsion. Subsequently, the creature demanded to be transported to her sleeping chambers, triggering a fresh wave of sobbing from the princess, who dreaded the physical contact with his chilly, damp skin. Once again compelled by paternal authority to honor her vow, she gingerly deposited him in a distant shadow of the room, only for him to threaten to inform her father unless he was placed directly onto the mattress. Consumed by explosive fury, she hurled the slippery animal forcefully against the masonry, miraculously causing him to morph into a handsome royal heir, who quickly explained that a malicious sorceress had cursed him. Dawn brought the arrival of a magnificent coach, drawn by 8 pristine steeds, accompanied by the prince's devoted attendant, known as Faithful Henry. This loyal aide had suffered such profound despair during his lord's amphibious captivity that he secured his own chest with 3 metallic straps to prevent his heart from shattering out of pure sorrow. As the royal couple departed in the elegant transport, the newly restored aristocrat detected a loud snapping noise, fearing the vehicle was collapsing beneath them. In reality, the sound resulted from the protective bindings forcefully detaching from the attendant's chest, signaling his overwhelming relief and joy at his master's liberation. Transitioning to another beloved narrative, Beauty and the Beast, you meet an affluent, bereaved trader residing in a grand estate alongside his dozen offspring, evenly divided between boys and girls. The junior-most female, affectionately called Beauty, embodies pure gentleness and virtue, standing in stark opposition to her cold-hearted, self-centered female siblings. Disaster strikes when a severe tempest decimates the patriarch's commercial armada, stripping him of his vast fortune and compelling the entire household to relocate to a humble cabin where physical labor becomes their new reality. Word eventually reaches the impoverished father that a single vessel from his ruined fleet has miraculously arrived at the docks, prompting him to organize an expedition to inspect the cargo. Before departing, he inquires if his progeny desire any specific souvenirs from his travels. The elder girls greedily request luxurious garments and precious gems, whereas the youngest merely wishes for his safe return. Pressured by her father to select a tangible present, she modestly requests a simple crimson blossom. Unfortunately, the traveler sets out only to become disoriented amidst yet another ferocious atmospheric disturbance. Stumbling ashore, the exhausted man discovers a seemingly abandoned fortress containing a lavish banquet prepared for unseen guests, which he gratefully consumes to restore his strength. Upon waking, he contemplates relocating his family to this magnificent sanctuary, yet pausing to snap a floral specimen from the grounds, summons a terrifying monstrosity intent on his destruction. Pleading desperately for mercy, the terrified father explains the innocent motive behind his floral theft, hoping to pacify the creature. The gargantuan proprietor agrees to spare the intruder's life, demanding, however, that a female heir must voluntarily substitute herself as a permanent captive. Devastated by this cruel ultimatum, the patriarch realizes he possesses no alternative but to accept the grim bargain. The monstrous host equips the departing guest with exquisite finery and gems for his dependents before sending him away. Returning to his modest dwelling, the grieving father presents the requested blossom to his child, while revealing the catastrophic consequence of his actions. Demonstrating immense courage, the devoted daughter volunteers to fulfill the pact, traveling to the ominous estate where she is surprisingly welcomed with lavish festivities, endless wardrobes, and culinary delights provided by her intimidating captor. As you observe their daily routine, the fearsome host proposes matrimony each evening, consistently receiving a polite but firm rejection from his guest. Following these denials, the young woman repeatedly experiences visions of a stunning aristocrat, slowly developing deep romantic feelings for this phantom figure, while mistakenly assuming he is a fellow prisoner hidden somewhere within the vast fortress. Despite conducting exhaustive searches, her quest proves fruitless, leading to severe melancholy and a desperate plea to temporarily reunite with her relatives. The creature grants her a leave of absence with a strict deadline of exactly 2 months, a timeline she carelessly ignores, until a premonition of her captor perishing in isolation jolts her into action. Sprinting back to the stronghold, she discovers him clinging to life, prompting a sudden epiphany of her genuine affection as she frantically gathers healing spring water for him. By nightfall, she formally accepts his marriage proposal, awakening the following dawn to find the hideous monster miraculously replaced by the very nobleman who had dominated her nighttime reveries. A lingering enchantment had trapped him in a hideous form, a hex destined to remain unbroken until he discovered genuine affection. Shifting our focus to the classic tale of Hansel and Gretel, we find a destitute lumberjack living on the edge of a massive woodland alongside his spouse and their 2 young ones. The son bore the name Hansel, while his sister was known as Gretel. When a severe famine struck their region, the struggling parents found themselves entirely unable to secure even the most basic provisions for survival. Desperate and heartbroken, the husband questioned how they could possibly nourish their impoverished offspring during such dire times. In response, the stepmother coldly resolved that abandoning the youngsters in the wilderness was their only alternative to collective starvation. A cruel scheme the father bitterly resisted, despite their bleak circumstances. Kept awake by the gnawing ache of their empty stomachs, the siblings overheard the woman's grim proposal. Fortunately, by cleverly gathering pale stones to mark their path, the resourceful boy guided them safely back to their cottage the following evening. Upon their arrival, the matriarch greeted them with furious resentment, whereas the woodcutter celebrated their survival with profound relief. Shortly thereafter, the grim scenario unfolded once more, prompting the desperate siblings to scatter morsels of bread as a makeshift trail. Tragically, the local avian wildlife consumed their fragile lifeline, leaving the brother and sister hopelessly adrift within the dense thicket. After wandering aimlessly for 3 days, a pristine white bird caught their attention, guiding them toward an extraordinary cottage constructed entirely from baked goods, pastries, and assorted confections. Famished, they immediately began devouring sections of the sugary structure before an elderly inhabitant emerged to warmly invite them inside, subsequently presenting her weary guests with a magnificent feast. Beneath her welcoming facade, however, the crone was actually a malevolent sorceress, who had deliberately designed the delectable dwelling to lure innocent youths into her clutches for a gruesome feast. At the break of dawn, the malicious hag imprisoned the boy within a cramped enclosure, simultaneously forcing the young girl into servitude to prepare rich meals meant to plump up her captive brother. Each morning, the visually impaired captor demanded the youth extend a digit through the bars to gauge his plumpness. Yet, the clever boy consistently substituted a slender bone. This cunning deception thoroughly baffled the villainess, leaving her utterly bewildered as to why her prisoner stubbornly refused to gain any weight. Eventually, the sorceress's ravenous appetite overwhelmed her limited patience, prompting her to instruct the girl to climb into the roaring hearth under the pretense of testing its temperature. Astutely recognizing the deadly trap meant to roast her alive, the quick-witted maiden feigned ignorance, claiming she simply did not comprehend how to enter the contraption. Scolding the child for her supposed foolishness, the exasperated crone demonstrated the process by thrusting her own head inside, which provided the perfect opportunity for the brave sister to shove her tormentor deep into the flames. With a swift motion, she slammed the heavy iron barrier shut and secured the lock, ensuring the wicked entity met a fiery and agonizing demise. Overjoyed by their sudden liberation, the siblings shared a tearful embrace before discovering numerous trunks overflowing with precious gems and gleaming pearls scattered throughout the sinister residence. After stuffing their garments with as much treasure as they could carry, the triumphant pair eventually navigated their way back to their familiar homestead. There, they joyously reunited with their grieving father, a man who had endured relentless sorrow since the terrible day he abandoned them, only to learn that his cruel wife had already passed away. Turning our attention to the legendary narrative of Sleeping Beauty, also known as Briar Rose, we encounter an ancient monarch and his queen who constantly mourned their inability to conceive an heir. During a solitary bath, the melancholy ruler's thoughts were interrupted by an amphibian leaping from the depths, boldly prophesying that she would deliver a female infant before another year concluded. True to the creature's startling prediction, a remarkably stunning princess entered the world, prompting the ecstatic sovereign to organize a lavish banquet in her honor. He extended invitations to his entire royal circle, making sure to include the realm's benevolent enchantresses who harbored a special fondness for the young. A grave oversight occurred, however, because the sovereign possessed merely 12 exquisite golden dishes for the 13 mystical women residing within his territory, forcing him to exclude one from the grand celebration. Following the magnificent feast, the magical guests began bestowing unparalleled blessings upon the newborn, showering her with traits like flawless beauty and immense wealth. Just as the 11th blessing was granted, the shunned 13th sorceress violently stormed into the hall, radiating pure fury over her deliberate exclusion. Bypassing any formal pleasantries, she maliciously decreed that the royal heir would fatally puncture her flesh upon a spinning wheel when she reached her 15th year. Fortunately, the final unpledged fairy intervened, mitigating the horrific death sentence into a profound slumber lasting an entire century. Desperate to shield his beloved offspring from this dark fate, the reigning lord immediately issued a sweeping mandate demanding the fiery destruction of every single spinning device across his entire domain. Nevertheless, on the very day the maiden celebrated her 15th year of life, her parents happened to be absent, leaving the inquisitive adolescent to roam the sprawling fortress entirely unsupervised. During her explorations, she eventually unlocked an obscure chamber containing an elderly woman diligently working with a strange, whirling apparatus. Intrigued by the merry motion of the unfamiliar tool, the naive teenager reached out to examine the device, instantly piercing her skin and plunging into a comatose state upon a nearby mattress, just as the vengeful hag had foretold. This supernatural lethargy rapidly consumed the entirety of the royal estate, paralyzing every courtier, beast, and rustling breeze, until the sprawling grounds fell into an eerie, suspended silence. Over the decades, a formidable barricade of razor-sharp brambles aggressively engulfed the structure, soaring higher with each passing season, until the grand citadel vanished entirely behind a wall of impenetrable flora. The haunting myth of the dormant briar rose gradually spread throughout the neighboring territories, inspiring generations of valiant noblemen to attempt a rescue mission through the lethal overgrowth. Tragically, these brave challengers found themselves hopelessly ensnared by the vine-like appendages, suffering agonizing deaths as they struggled vainly against the unyielding botanical fortress. Exactly 100 years later, just as the cursed enchantment was destined to shatter, a daring young aristocrat approached the fearsome thicket, watching in awe as the deadly spikes miraculously transformed into blooming flora that parted willingly for his advance. Proceeding unchallenged into the forgotten chambers, he discovered the slumbering beauty and gently pressed his lips against hers, an act that instantly shattered the century-long spell and resurrected the frozen palace. Following their joyous matrimonial union, the couple enjoyed a profoundly harmonious existence for the remainder of their days. Ultimately, these timeless narratives invite you to examine your immediate reality through a remarkably distinct, magical lens. Engaging with such fantastical stories serves not as a cowardly retreat from your daily existence, but rather as a profound enrichment of your personal human experience. The legendary author J.R.R. Tolkien once noted that immersing himself in mythical tales initially awakened his mind to the profound power of language and the sheer marvel of everyday elements, from timber and metal to a burning hearth and a simple meal. In truth, your reality is already brimming with extraordinary enchantment, provided you are willing to truly observe your surroundings, which means it remains your personal responsibility to rouse your senses to the authentic magnificence of existence. The timeless myths storytellers pass down about gleaming, gilded apples exist simply to remind you of that long-lost instant when you first marveled at their natural emerald hue. In the very same way, ancient legends often depict streams overflowing with rich vintages merely to shock your memory into appreciating the pure, untamed thrill of a river rushing with ordinary, life-giving water.